Imagine a scene, utterly impossible, a violation of all known history. The year is 1945. You stand in the office of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the conqueror of Berlin. And there, on the wall, hangs a formal portrait of the leader of the Third Reich. It is the stuff of fever dreams, of cheap speculative fiction. For we know with certainty who fought whom. The battle lines were absolute. And yet, when we peel back the layers of dogma surrounding the year 1812, we are confronted with discrepancies on precisely this scale. The official history presents a seamless narrative of patriotic resistance, but the documents of the era, the strange artifacts left in its wake, sketch a profoundly different reality. We are told Napoleon invaded Russia to crush Tsar Alexander I. But a strange vacuum emerges when one examines the French emperor's personal correspondence, his staff's own documents. The name Russia, as we understand it, is conspicuously absent. In its place, European sources and maps of the period speak of Moscovia, of Great Tartary, of a confrontation with what they called Asiatic hordes. The impression is not of an invasion of the Russian Empire, but of a campaign against an entirely different power, a power meticulously erased from the pages of our textbooks. The very geography of the war raises even more questions. The capital of the Russian Empire, its administrative heart, and the home of the Tsar was St. Petersburg. It was closer to the advancing French armies, strategically more vulnerable. Any rational commander seeking to decapitate an enemy state would have struck there. But Napoleon, the recognized military genius of his age, makes an inexplicable maneuver. He ignores the capital. He marches his vast army deep into the continent, toward Moscow. Why would he covet an old merchant city when the political heart of the empire beat on the banks of the Neva? The move is logical under only one condition: if the true capital of the force he came to fight was not St. Petersburg, but Moscow. The strangeness continues, down to the details often dismissed as historical anecdotes. We are told Napoleon waited on Poklanaya Hill for the boyars to bring him the keys to the city, but the boyar class had been officially abolished by Peter the Great at the dawn of the 18th century, more than 100 years before this event. To expect a delegation of boyars in 1812 would be akin to expecting knights in full armor at a modern summit of nations. Either French intelligence suffered a catastrophic failure, ignorant of the very structure of its enemy, or the men they called boyars truly existed, and they belonged to that same vanished Muscovite power. History, it is said, is a story agreed upon. But what happens when the agreement frays? When the maps contradict the campaign? When the titles of the vanquished belong to a ghost empire? The campaign of 1812 may not have been just a war of armies, but a war on memory itself. A conflict whose most decisive battle was not fought on the fields of Borodino, but on the pages of the history books that followed. A battle to define not only who won, but who, precisely, had lost. We are told Moscow burned because it was a city of wood. A simple narrative, taught to school children, but it is a narrative that crumbles under the weight of fact. By special decree, stretching back to the time of Peter the Great, the construction of wooden buildings in the city's core had been forbidden, a measure to prevent this very kind of catastrophe. By the year 1812, the center of Moscow was a fortress of stone and brick, and cities of... The events that unfolded were described by those who endured them as a global cataclysm, a force that annihilated the city down to its very foundations. Here, the neat lines of political intrigue dissolve, and a far deeper horror begins. Paper can be rewritten, maps can be redrawn, But the physical evidence of a city's obliteration cannot be so easily concealed. What happened in Moscow fits no description of an ordinary fire. The testimony of eyewitnesses hints at the deployment of a technology that, according to the official record, simply could not have existed. From a window, the French Brigadier General, Count Philippe de Ségur, watched in disbelief as the inferno consumed not just timber frames, but the solid stone ramparts of Kitagorod. In his memoirs, he would later describe the spectacle as something beyond the limits of human understanding. An army that had, only the day before, seen itself as a glorious conqueror was suddenly reduced to a band of criminals being judged by the very heavens. This was no mere figure of speech. Testimonies from both sides of the conflict paint a picture not of arson, but of a technological disaster. Officers stationed in different parts of the city, independent of one another, reported bizarre phenomena in the sky. They saw not drifting embers carried on the wind, but cohesive, fiery spheres descending from above. According to de Ségur's own records, one such globe of fire descended directly upon the palace of Prince Trubetskoy, which erupted in flame instantaneously. This is the language of a targeted bombardment, of an unknown weapon, not the chaotic spread of a fire set by a torch. Even more inexplicable is the nature of the destruction itself. Stone, as we know, does not burn. It may crack from thermal shock, it may be blackened by soot, but it does not vanish. Yet in the Moscow of 1812, stone edifices were seen to literally explode from within. Witnesses described a terrifying sequence. A faint crackle, a blinding flash, a thin wisp of smoke. And where a monumental structure had stood, only ruins remained. Brick and stone crumbled to dust, as if pulverized by a colossal shockwave or an impossible vibration. History is written by the victors, a narrative shaped by agendas and time. But the earth itself keeps a different record, a record etched not in ink, but in pulverized stone, and the lingering questions that refuse to be extinguished by the ashes. The evidence etched into the ruins defies simple explanation. The complete consumption of materials, the vitrified stone and melted brick, cannot be blamed on the burning of wooden furniture within. The casualty statistics alone shatter the myth of an ordinary fire. For comparison, we look to the documented Moscow fire of 1737. At that time, the city was a sprawling metropolis of wood. The blaze was terrifying, consuming thousands of homes. Yet the death toll was just 94 souls. People had time to flee, to escape the inexorable advance of the flames. But in 1812, in a city now built largely of stone, the calculus of death changes entirely. By the admission of the French themselves, some 30,000 soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée perished in the inferno. This is a staggering figure, comparable to the losses in a major engagement such as the Battle of Borodino. How could 30,000 healthy, mobile men, an army of conquerors, be burned alive in a city from which they could have simply walked away? It suggests a destructive force that was instantaneous and inescapable, leaving no chance for survival. The anomalies continued long after the flames subsided. Over the ruins of the city, incessant, heavy rains began to fall, as if nature itself were trying to wash away the traces of something deeply toxic. Survivors, both Russian and French, described their state as one of profound shock. They suffered from a mysterious weakness and illness, with symptoms that today would lead physicians to suspect radiation sickness or severe chemical poisoning. Such a destruction of resources and men benefited neither Russia nor France. This catastrophe became the great equalizer. Yesterday's enemies, shaken by what they had witnessed, warmed themselves at the same fires, the war forgotten. It was as if, in that moment, they ceased to be adversaries and became joint witnesses to the annihilation of something else, something third, far more ancient and significant. If one looks closer at the behavior of these two armies, a disturbing detail emerges. They were onto the same task, to cleanse the territory. To distinguish them in the smoke of the inferno was nearly impossible, and this resemblance holds the key to the next, equally shocking mystery. When we examine the opposing sides of the 1812 conflict, it begins to feel as though we are looking into a mirror that only slightly distorts the reflection. Official history insists on an irreconcilable enmity between the Russian Empire and France, but the day-to-day reality of that war presents facts that utterly shatter this picture. One of the most bewildering elements is the soldiers' uniforms. It would seem that on the battlefield, the ability to instantly distinguish friend from foe is a matter of life and death. However, the famed hussar and partisan Denis Davidov, in his memoirs, described a series of telling incidents. During his raids, his detachments were frequently attacked by Russian peasants. These common people, seeing the tunics, the cut of the cloth, the epaulets and shakos, could not tell them apart from the invaders. Perhaps the true lines of conflict are not drawn between nations or empires. Perhaps they are etched far deeper, hidden from the pages of history, visible only to those who dare to look at the ashes and ask not who won, but what was truly lost. In the vast, scorched landscapes of 1812, a terrifying confusion reigned. Russian peasants, caught between two colossal armies, could not distinguish liberator from invader. The green and white uniforms of the Tsar's soldiers were almost indistinguishable from the blue and white of Napoleon's Grande Armée. So complete was the disorientation that Russian partitheir military identity. They donned the simple caftans of the peasantry and grew thick, untamed beards. Also their own people would cease to see them as the enemy. Whispers from the archives suggest this confusion was no accident. Certain historians point to an alleged correspondence between Tsar Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte, a dialogue where the two monarchs discussed the unification of color and style for their military dress. If true, it stands as a unique and unsettling moment in the annals of warfare. The supreme commanders of two mortally opposed armies coordinating to ensure their soldiers looked nearly identical. This speaks less to a war of annihilation and more to the staging of a joint parade, or perhaps a vast police action. A deeper cognitive dissonance emerges from the question of language. We are taught to see the War of 1812 as a great patriotic struggle, the crucible of the Russian national spirit. Why, then, was the entire official record of this war conducted in the language of the aggressor? This was not merely the affectation of a salon aristocracy for whom French was a second mother tongue. We are speaking of state documents of the highest order. Alexander I's manifesto declaring victory was written in French. Tsarist decrees issued in 1813 were published in French. An album of portraits honoring the heroes of the war, printed in St. Petersburg immediately after Napoleon's expulsion, was captioned entirely in the language of the vanquished foe. Imagine for a moment Stalin issuing the order of victory over Germany exclusively in German. The notion is absurd. Yet for the era of 1812, this paradox is presented as the norm. The relationship between the emperors themselves only deepens the mystery. At a memorial near the Berezina River, the site of the tragic death of thousands of French soldiers, a monument was erected. It bears the profiles of two men, Alexander and Napoleon. What did their contemporaries, or their descendants, mean to convey by this? That both had won, or that they had acted in unison? Stranger still were the centenary celebrations in 1912. At a Jubilee exhibition in St. Petersburg, portraits of Napoleon were lovingly decorated with fresh flowers. Commemorative cups, perfumes, and souvenirs were produced, many of which heroicized the French army. One painting from the period depicts a startling scene. Alexander I seemingly presenting Cossacks, Bashkirs, and Kalmyks to Napoleon. The Russian forces are not portrayed as adversaries, but as a resource being transferred from one partner to another. Adding to the enigma, portraits of Russian commanders from the era often show them adorned with the orders of Prussia and Austria, nations that were, officially, Napoleon's allies. The evidence, when viewed together, paints a disturbing picture. It compels us to ask a difficult question. Was the War of 1812 truly a clash of empires? Or was it something else entirely? A coordinated, punitive action by a united European elite, the House of Romanov included, against a far more inconvenient enemy, an enemy they both had reason to fear. History is written on paper. It can be burned, its ink can fade, its narratives rewritten to suit a ruling dynasty. But there are other witnesses that cannot be silenced and are far more difficult to forge in hindsight. They are hewn from granite, cast in bronze. For 200 years, monuments to the War of 1812 have stood in plain sight, and if we look closely, their details tell a story that is deeply unsettling. The most glaring inconsistency lies hidden within the highest symbols of state. The Russian Empire was represented by a two-headed eagle, gazing both east and west. Napoleonic France was symbolized by a single-headed eagle, heir to the legions of Rome. Logic dictates that the graves of French soldiers should bear the French eagle, and monuments to Russian heroes, the Russian one. At the Shevardino Redoubt, a monument requested by France honors the fallen soldiers of the Grande Armée. It is crowned, fittingly, by the single-headed imperial eagle. This is just, it is logical. But when we approach the obelisk dedicated to the supreme commander of the Russian army, Mikhail Kutuzov, we are met with a profound shock. At its apex is not the two-headed symbol of Russia, but the very same single-headed eagle of France. This cannot be dismissed as a sculptor's error. Monuments of this stature required the personal approval of the emperor himself. To imagine a monument to a Soviet marshal of the Second World War, crowned with the heraldry of the Third Reich, is unthinkable. Yet, in the case of Kutuzov, and on other monuments to Russia's liberators, as in the city of Smolensk, this is precisely what we see. The single-headed eagles are everywhere. It forces a radical question. What if, in 1812, this symbol was not exclusively the mark of an enemy? Perhaps it signified a unified army, or an alliance in which Russia and France acted as one. The strangeness extends into numismatics. In the National Library of France, medals struck to commemorate the capture of Moscow depict the city's church domes. But they are crowned not with orthodox crosses, but with symbols more akin to pagan solar signs. On a medal dedicated to the Battle of Borodino, the soldiers are clad in uniforms that defy easy classification, blurring the lines between the two opposing forces. Paper archives may burn. Official histories can be curated to serve the powerful, but the silent testimony of granite and bronze endures. It does not offer easy answers. Instead, it leaves us with a disquieting truth, that the past we inherit is not always the past that was, and the hardest truths are often those hidden in plain sight. The accepted histories depict them in the uniforms of the 19th century. But look closer. The art of the era often shows them clad not in wool and brass, but in the classical armor of ancient Rome. In the grand battle scenes, the eye is drawn to a disquieting anomaly. Not 2 armies, but 3. Their banners unfurled on the same field of conflict, a silent testament to a third, unnamed power. If Tsar Alexander I and Napoleon were merely the 2 principal duelists, who was this third combatant? A final verdict on official geography is delivered not in a book, but on a map, etched in stone upon a memorial from that very epoch. It purports to show the Russian Empire, its borders defended and secured. Yet those borders end, abruptly and inexplicably, at the Ural mountain range. The vast, sprawling territories of Siberia and the Far East, today an indivisible part of the nation, are simply absent, not included within the domains of St. Petersburg. Either the imperial authority was ignorant of the true scale of its own lands, a deeply improbable scenario, or the Romanov state in the early 19th century did, in fact, stop at the Urals. This stone evidence confronts us with a frightening yet unavoidable question. If the Russian Empire ended there, what lay beyond, to the east? A great emptiness? Unclaimed lands? History abhors a vacuum. Such a void would have been filled. There must have been another state, a power possessing immense territory and untold resources. It was likely against this colossal neighbor that the monarchs of Europe and the Romanovs of St. Petersburg forged an unspoken alliance. Here, another civilization emerges from the shadows, one not merely conquered, but systematically expunged from the memory of humankind. The answer to what lay beyond the Urals can be found, hidden in plain sight, within geographical atlases and encyclopedias published before the 19th century. There, across the vast expanse of Eurasia, from the Urals to the Pacific, from the Arctic Ocean to the borders of India, stretched a nation designated in bold letters, Grand Tartary, Great Tartary. Within its domain was a territory known as Muscovite Tartary, with its capital in Moscow. This single fact reframes everything. It may explain why Napoleon, in his private letters and military orders, spoke not of Russia, but of Tartary and the Asiatic hordes. If one accepts this hypothesis, the entire narrative of the War of 1812 is turned on its head. It ceases to be a war of patriotic defense and transforms into a massive, coordinated operation of the West against the East. In this new coordinate system, Alexander I and Napoleon are no longer sworn enemies. They are allies, representatives of a unified European civilization, the new world order of its time. The Romanov dynasty, Western-facing, French-speaking, and alien to ancient traditions, was based in St. Petersburg. Napoleon had united continental Europe under his banner. Their shared objective could only have been the ancient and independent heartland of Muscovite Tartary, a splinter of an older, grander empire that stood in the way of their geopolitical ambitions. The victors, it is said, write the histories. But perhaps their greatest victory is not in the battles they won, but in the histories they erased, leaving behind only questions carved in stone and the faint outline of a world we were never meant to know. The world was to be remade. And so the blow was struck, not at the western-facing St. Petersburg, but at Moscow, the heart of an ancient and defiant power. This single strategic choice unlocks a strange and unsettling iconography, a key to understanding the War of 1812. Look to the medals and reliefs struck to commemorate the campaign. The soldiers of the United Army are depicted in the armor of ancient Rome. This is no mere flourish of classicism. It is a symbol, a declaration. This was the banner of the Holy Roman Empire, a legacy claimed by both the French Emperor and the Russian Tsar in their drive to Europeanize their domains. But they did not fight ghosts of the past. They fought a different kind of man entirely. In the old engravings and paintings, we see them. Bearded warriors, armed with bows, arrows, and spears. The official histories name them Bashkirs, or Cossacks, loyal subjects in the service of the Tsar. Yet the scenes captured by the artists of the day suggest a profoundly different reality. In one famous work, Tsar Alexander I presents these men to Napoleon. This is not the proud display of an elite allied corps. It is the presentation of a curiosity, a trophy. They are shown as one might show the captured chieftains of a conquered tribe. Their clothing is foreign, their weapons obsolete. And most telling of all, they do not remove their headdress before the two emperors. An act of defiance so profound, so unthinkable by the etiquette of the time, that it can only have one meaning. These were not subjects. They were the last remnants of the shattered armies of Tartary, the governors of captured territories being compelled to accept a new order. Far from the front lines, the Russian countryside itself was convulsing. The historical chronicles speak sparingly of 67 major peasant uprisings that erupted in that single year. But the forces sent to crush these rebellions were not French. They were the regular troops of Tsar Alexander. The common people, clinging to older traditions, perhaps to an older dynasty, saw both invading armies, the French and the one from St. Petersburg, as occupiers. They fought against a forced westernization, against the serfdom that traveled with the Romanov dynasty. The year 1812, then, was not a war of national defense. It was the final, brutal endpoint for the existence of Great Tartary. Its capital was incinerated with methods of total destruction. Its elite was annihilated or assimilated, and its very name was scoured from the maps of the world. History was rewritten by the victors. The Romanovs claimed a patriotic triumph over the usurper Napoleon, burying the truth of their alliance. The annihilation of a vast civilization was disguised, reframed as the invasion of the 12 tongues. But in the aftermath of great crimes, after the victim is buried, the question of inheritance always arises. War is a venture of colossal expense. Someone had to pay for this banquet of destruction, and the financial trail left in the ashes of Moscow leads to a final piece of evidence, one that cannot be so easily burned away. Every great crime, from a simple robbery to the annihilation of a civilization, leaves a financial trail. Money is the lifeblood of war, and its movement often speaks more truth than the grandiloquent speeches of generals. When the smoke finally cleared over the ashes of Moscow in 1812, a logical question arose. Where had the untold riches of the ancient capital vanished? It is known that convoys laden with gold, silver, and jewels were hauled from the Kremlin and the opulent manors of the city. Legends of Napoleon's hoard, supposedly sunk in a remote lake during the retreat, have tantalized treasure hunters for 2 centuries. Yet not a single significant treasure has ever been found. These riches never resurfaced in Paris, nor in St. Petersburg. They dissolved, as if into the very air. But if we examine the financial ledger of the war, a picture emerges that completely inverts our understanding of victor and vanquished. By the laws of war, the losing side pays indemnity. The winner plunders, seizes trophies, and issues invoices for the damages. Yet the behavior of the Russian army in Paris in 1814 was an act of unprecedented gentility. The Cossacks did not loot the Louvre. Russian officers paid for their dinners in gold. There were no trophies taken, no accounts settled. Moreover, there is a documented fact that historians often prefer not to publicize. The commander of the Russian occupation corps, Count Mikhail Vorontsov, before his departure from France, personally paid off all the debts of his officers and soldiers to their French creditors. The sum was colossal, equivalent to approximately 30 tons of silver. Consider the sheer absurdity of this act. Russia, the victorious nation, its ancient capital in ruins and its lands ravaged, does not demand compensation. Instead, it pays its defeated enemy an enormous sum of money. This cannot be explained away by chivalry or honor. In the arena of high politics, such concepts are phantom. In the world of business, however, it is called the final settlement of a contract. If one dares to hypothesize that Napoleon was not a conqueror, but a mercenary contractor, hired to eradicate a power known as Muscovite Tartary, then the vanished gold of Moscow becomes the first installment of his fee. The payments made by Vorontsov and other officials become the closing of the remaining debt between partners. In this context, the immense subsidies that Tsar Alexander I received from Great Britain suddenly make sense. This was a global restructuring of power, where France and Russia acted as a unified fist of the West, striking down the last bastion of an independent Asia. Tartary fell. Its wealth was divided. Its history was rewritten, and its people were given a beautiful fable about a great patriotic war, a story crafted to conceal an act of the highest betrayal and genocide. We live in a world painted by the victors, where history textbooks are merely the agreed-upon version of events, a narrative convenient for the ruling. Through the hardened concrete of the official narrative, the truth inevitably forces its way into the light. The facts we have confronted, from the ashes of inexplicable fires to the foreign eagles perched, impossibly, on monuments to national heroes, are merely the visible peaks of a submerged reality. This is only the tip of the iceberg. To descend into this rabbit hole is to discover its depths are far more profound than one could ever conceive. Countless documents and vital testimonies remain sealed, locked away under the highest classifications. Others lie in plain sight, available in public archives, yet are systematically ignored by the sentinels of academic history. But a fact that is buried does not turn to dust. A story that is silenced does not cease to exist. It simply waits, dormant, for the moment the ground above it finally gives way.